Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and it is number 33, going out on October the 31st, and we all know what day that is. Halloween is much bigger in the UK than it was when I was young, but then I think I'm old enough that I remember all the witch trials. Just for fun, because we came up with a Halloween list. How do you connect that to life sciences? Well, this is our list of the 10 scariest things about biotech. I actually put that question to AI, and it is quite clear that AI has not yet developed a sense of humour or the ability to create something funny. Or maybe that's just the one that I use. And maybe I'm not funny either, so here goes in no particular order. The top 10 scariest things about biotech. Fundraising, failed clinical trials, the so-called talent drain, and here's one that I'm sure many of you can relate to, being on the road a lot, and that's what conference am I at and what month is this? And another scary thing, yet another regulatory hurdle. For many of us, what's also scary is the number of acronyms and drug names that even AI can't pronounce. Back to those events, and something else that can be scary is awkward partnering meetings. Next, realizing that your lead asset will launch after your toddler becomes a parent. And another, wondering if you can offset the lab rent increase by working in the dark. And finally, the only endpoint that was met was a rare and unusual side effect that you can now develop a new drug for. Let's move on. Last week we had conversations with Lithuanian company Vugene and with Amphista Therapeutics. This week we've got fungi or fungi, depending on how you pronounce it, Beckley Psytech on psychedelics, and we talk pain relief with PharmNovo at NLS Days in Gothenburg. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other comments or suggestions, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you're interested in advertising with us, or sponsoring a podcast episode. Or maybe you can even add your own Halloween biotech horror. So first, let's take a look at the news you may have missed over at deeptechdigest.com. A drug combination could reduce the risk of prostate cancer deaths. $22.4 million has been raised for a respiratory infections nasal spray, and more funds have been raised for a prosthetic joint infection treatment. I made the mistake of looking that up on Google, and the images were quite disturbing. There is promise for early Parkinson's detection analysis, custom-designed receptors can boost cancer-fighting T-cells, and there have been advances in cell therapy for Huntington's disease treatments. Lilly is acquiring Adverum Biotechnologies. There are hopes for the development of an anti-ulcer vaccine, and China's first AI drug has completed its phase 3 trial. Is there a new era in Alzheimer's therapy? There have been positive phase 3 results for an idiopathic nephrotic syndrome drug, and Montreal biotech LifeLore Pathways has launched to accelerate microbial innovation. And you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. So, 3 interviews this week, and the first one is from Life Sciences Baltics. It's a short chat with Funki, an Estonian food biotech company developing mycoproteins. Sirli Rosenvald is Funki's CEO. Perfect. All right. So could you tell me a little bit about your company, what you do?
Yeah, I'm Sirli from company Funki, and we are from Estonia, and we are producing mycoprotein, which is a sustainable protein that could really help to mitigate the risks and solve some challenges that we have in our current food systems.
And what can it be used in?
So mycoprotein is a very good ingredient. So first of all, it's really high in protein, but it's also high in fibers. And I would say that the most classical application is vegan products, so meat alternatives. But I really believe that it has a potential in hybrid concepts. So you mix animal protein and mycoprotein, but also pet food, animal feed. So I think in EU we are in a need of new protein sources because we are not producing enough ourselves. So I really believe that actually mycoprotein could have the potential to fulfill the protein need in different sort of applications.
And also with climate change and the ability to grow products inside, that helps too.
Yes, because if you think what is the current situation, then the population is growing, but our planet has its limitations, and due to the climate change we also cannot produce as much food anymore, and there are very often severe weather conditions which also influence how much food we get out from the classical methods. So mycoprotein as well as other biotechnology based food production systems enables to mitigate these risks, so we can really produce food in controlled environments. Doesn't matter what's the weather, it doesn't matter if we have arable lands, and also zoonotical diseases, other things that are really common. So I would say that biotechnology definitely has a potential to solve our food crisis for the future.
Right, and what about producing at scale? Is that an issue?
Yes, so biotechnological processes scaling is definitely one of the challenges. We are currently in the process of that. We have already scaled, let's say, from lab like 100 times larger scale, and we have seen the challenges, but they are all solvable. But the other thing is, of course, that they need a lot of resources and investments in infrastructure. So this is also something to need to be solved. So definitely right now we don't have enough infrastructure for biotechnological food production. But hopefully it will also change in the future.
And what about the knowledge of the products? Do you have to do a lot of education to get people to understand what it is?
Yeah, that's true. If you want to introduce some new type of food, I would say that food is something that is mainly traditional, and people are not looking for high innovation or novelty in food. So there is a lot of work needs to be done to educate consumers to understand. But I think mycoprotein, as they are fungi, this is natural resource. We are not processing it any highly. We are just giving it some food, growing it in the water, and then taking the biomass. So I think that the trends for the consumers regarding clean label and natural thing, and also like the health thing. So mycoprotein helps to tick all these boxes. So we just need to talk and educate, and I really believe that consumers will accept it as one of the protein options on their table.
Yeah, absolutely. And where are you selling to? Are you selling across Europe or?
So we are in a pre-commercial stage at this point, but our aim is to sell B2B ingredients. So we are not targeting consumers directly ourselves. So we are selling our ingredient to food producers. We are right now planning to have our first facility in Estonia, but of course we want to scale the production all around the world. But we want to keep the production local. So we would scale by adding new production units in different locations where you should produce for local consumers and customers.
Is the government being helpful with that?
I would say yes. So we have got a lot of support with, let's say, applied research grants from the government, which has helped us to get this far as we are. So now we are actively looking for private funding, so we could really set up our production unit and develop the technology further. There is always room for more optimization, getting more costs down. So I think it will not be done at one point and saying that there is nothing more we can do better. So it's a work in process.
Is that why you're here today?
Yes, so we are looking for investors, but actually we are also looking for partners, because we are also looking into possibilities that we could use food industry side streams to feed the fungi, so we could have more circular process. So we are also looking for that kind of partnership. Whoever food industry, food ingredients producers, food producers who have some kind of side streams that are, let's say, high in sugar, high in components that our fungi need, so we could utilize it and help to reduce their environmental impact at the same time as we reduce our products.
I really enjoyed the diversity of Life Sciences Baltics. Some really interesting companies from Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania in attendance. Great event if you've not been. Now we're switching events and heading to Gothenburg for NLS Days, where I have lots more interviews over the coming weeks. Not sure how to fit them all in without a 7-hour episode, but I'm sure we'll get there eventually. Definitely before next year's NLS Days in Stockholm. So, in this interview, we're talking about pain with PharmNovo's CEO, Per von Mentzer.
So maybe then first, if you could just tell me a little bit about your background and a bit about the company.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Per von Mentzer, and I'm the CEO of PharmNovo, a drug development company situated in Lund, Sweden. I've been engaged in a company for 7, almost 8 years. Joined in the beginning in the board, but has then taken a bigger role and been CEO for the company the last 4 years.
And how did the transition work? Was it a good transition? Because sometimes people fall into a CEO position because nobody else will do it, or is it because of your background? How did that happen?
In fact, when I joined, it was to help build up the company that was founded by Per von Mentzer. We're relatives, we're cousins, and Bengt invited me to join the company at a stage when he needed more business-oriented people to actually help build up the company. That was, at the time, mainly run by scientists. So I came in basically to support the build-up and expansion.
Is that, do you think, common in biotech companies, that the initial idea is science and that the people that had the idea become the CEOs, but that they don't necessarily have that business background?
Indeed, I think that's very common. Either it's a spin-out from maybe academia. In this case, actually, the founder, Per von Mentzer, he worked 30 years at AstraZeneca. And when he pre-retired, he managed to get a license on a few shelved projects. And what we're doing today is based on one of those projects. And so this is a spin-out from Astra originally. I think your question is very relevant. A lot of scientists or life science people in general with less company or business background are usually driving these startups for years and years and years. And I think Bengt had a good understanding for the need to bring in other kind of people. And I was one of them. But also there were other people that were brought into the board at the same point in time. So he was clever, the founder, taking in different kind of competencies.
And so could you tell me a bit about what the company does?
Yes, indeed. We are developing novel drugs for chronic pain, and more specifically, actually, neuropathic pain, which is the first indication, selective. And we have something which might be, for many people, a bit difficult to grasp initially. We have an opioid, and that scares some people when you say that. But the fact is that we have something which is completely different from conventional opioids. Without getting into too much detail, there are actually 3 different opioid receptors in us. And conventional opioids, they act on something called a mu receptor. And we have an agonist, which means that it activates a receptor which only activates the delta receptor. And there you get very effective pain relief without the side effects that are associated with conventional opioids. But of course, it's a story that needs to be told.
The typical thing with opioids has always been, especially in the US, has been the addiction side of things. So there's no danger of that with the Delta.
No, we have gone to 4 studies and tests and anything to actually prove that it doesn't. And we haven't seen any signs whatsoever. And it's known to be the case with the delta receptor, but we have tested it preclinically We've been through the phase 1, which is the first study in humans, and we haven't seen any signs at all that we touch the mu receptor, which is responsible for that risk. So I think we can claim today that we've done everything to test that, and we don't see any signs or risk for abuse potential.
Have other companies been working on that receptor, or are you unique in that?
As I said, it's originally a spin-out from AstraZeneca. They had a huge program, really researching and developing in the field of delta agonists, but it was abandoned. In parallel, at that time, even Pfizer Adelor was having a program in this field, which also in their case was more or less abandoned. They were quite advanced, actually, both. So what we say today is that for reasons that maybe were not directly related to research and development efforts, but for company strategic reasons, this is a missed opportunity. We took it up. PharmNovo developed new compounds with even better characteristics, especially this very high selectivity on the delta receptor. And today we have a candidate which has great potency in relieving pain, has good effect in migraine. It also reduces anxiety and depression in preclinical testing. And on top of that, very safe and tolerable. So it looks very promising.
Where are you at with clinical trials currently? You mentioned you'd finished phase 1.
Yes, we are ready to move into phase 2A, proof of concept. And in our case, the first indication, neuropathic pain. And that is planned to start mid next year, subject to funding, because we're right now raising funds for the first proof of concept study. A lot of preparations have been done. We recently, last week, got the clinical trial application approved in Spain. So basically we are ready to move forward. Subject to funding, we will do that in a bit more than half a year.
And how quickly after that would you expect to see some even interim results?
The study is expected to have a full duration of some 1.5 years. You count on, of course, patient recruitment time and plus the actual study time, of course. So by the end of 2027, we expect to have headline results, which of course will be extremely exciting to see if we really translate into humans and get the same very high efficiency in pain reduction.
How's the fundraising going?
It's looking promising now, but it has been challenging. The climate last 2, maybe 3 years has been quite difficult, and of course for us it's relatively large sums of money needed. The Series A that we are raising now is supposed to bring in 12 million euros to cover this 2-year journey and reaching headline results. And the market has been difficult, so it's taken longer than expected, but we do see some promise.
When you start talking about things like new antibiotics or pain relief, the returns can sometimes be less. Has that been a consideration or a concern?
No, I think that biotechs in general have had a higher difficulty to raise funds in the last couple of years. It is a high-risk environment to develop new drugs compared to medtech or health tech and other, maybe also more, let's say, product-related businesses. And it has historically been, of course, also colored by a bit more hesitation to move into the pain space. Pain is difficult. So if you're doing drug development and you're targeting to develop a new drug in the pain space, you need to have a very strong story, which I think we do have. But then in that climate we've been experiencing, it's been tough.
What does the future look like for the company? Are there any other things in the pipeline? Or?
We do have follow-up compounds, but they are less advanced. But they could be extremely important for a future pharma partner, of course. The strategy for PharmNovo is to find a pharma partner after proof of concept for several reasons. Moving ahead in this kind of indication means large studies in both phase 2B and phase 3, and this is typically a big pharma project. And we do already have early dialogue with a number of pharma companies to pave the way for a possible partnership after proof of concept.
It seems like you're heading in the right direction anyway. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think what we're doing, and the reason I joined was actually because I was motivated by the founder Bengt when he talked about the huge unmet medical need and the promise that this mode of action could potentially solve something which is an unmet medical need. There are millions and millions of people suffering. We are so enthusiastic about the development so far, and it's mainly related to, we know the severe suffering for people with neuropathic pain and other chronic pain states, and we think we can solve it. And we need eventually a pharma partner to help us solve it, of course. But I think that's the vision. The vision for Bengt and also for the whole team is basically to solve this new mode of action and get something into the market that can help people suffering.
And what was the reasoning for being at NLS Days?
Coming here, like several conferences previously, mainly to meet investors and try to close this round as soon as possible. But also more and more now seeking contact with pharma. And we had a couple of pharma meetings as well now, even with some new people we didn't meet before. So some Japanese pharma companies are here, which is quite interesting.
Definitely an interesting subject, and anything that can be done to alleviate what's being called the opioid crisis has to be a good thing. Lastly this week we're talking psychedelics, which really seem to be coming to the fore. One company right at the cutting edge is Beckley Psytech, and we had a chance to talk to the company's CEO, Cosmo Feilding Mellen. Hi Cosmo, thanks for joining us this week. First, maybe you could tell us a bit about Beckley Psytech.
So I co-founded Beckley Psytech really with the mission to try to develop psychedelics into approved pharmaceutical medicines for patients with serious mental health conditions. So that's really been the kind of grand vision. And within that space, what we've really tried to focus on is how to make these new treatments as accessible and kind of scalable as possible for patients. There's a lot of context that one would need to give, but basically one of the key challenges with psychedelic therapies, they've shown really compelling safety and efficacy data in a range of clinical trials around depression, and other mental health conditions like addiction, anxiety, PTSD, etc. On the other hand, the way they're delivered is they are under supervision in a clinic, which requires a lot of resource to supervise a single patient, especially with the first generation of drugs like psilocybin and LSD. The psychoactive effects last for a whole day, essentially. So what we were looking to do was, could we develop a drug that has similar efficacy and tolerability to the first generation of drugs, but in a way that the treatment is a much more scalable treatment, so a much shorter time in the clinic. And so that's what we've really targeted with BPL-003, our lead program. And that's just gone through phase 2B in a study in treatment-resistant depression. It's shown really robust data showing kind of strong antidepressant effects that are durable and kind of rapid antidepressant effects. And the treatment only takes about 2 hours. So we think this is a really promising drug for a kind of scalable treatment for this whole new class of kind of psychiatric intervention.
What's the overall status? I'm taking your company out of it, but what's the scene of the psychedelic medicine sector looking like right now?
So I think maybe to set it in its context as you'll be aware, and most of your listeners will be aware, there's enormous unmet need in psychiatry. So mental health is a massive and growing disease burden across the world. And there's been a kind of dearth of innovation in this space for a long time. So the current standard of care, like SSRIs, these kind of daily oral medications, for many people have side effects that are kind of intolerable, and for many people simply don't work. So there's a huge unmet need for kind of new ways to treat mental health conditions like depression. And psychedelics have emerged as a genuinely new class in this field. So they are a different way of delivering it. It fits within this idea of interventional psychiatry. So rather than a daily dose, you're talking about a treatment where you go to a clinic and have an intervention on a single day, and you're looking for a sustained response from that single clinic visit rather than taking a pill every day. What the data has shown so far is really, really compelling data in multiple independent clinical trials that, when delivered under supervision in a clinical setting, psychedelics can induce these kind of robust and sustained antidepressant effects. That's the kind of excitement. And in an area where there's been so little innovation, this really does, one has to be careful about hyperbole, but this really does represent the potential to kind of revolutionize the way psychiatry works in mainstream healthcare. And there are a number of companies working in this space with we could call it first, second, and third generation psychedelics, but there are several companies with phase 3 assets at the moment. So oral psilocybin is in phase 3 for treatment-resistant depression. MDMA is in phase 3 for post-traumatic stress disorder. And LSD is in phase 3 for anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. And then there are kind of the second generation drugs, which, like ours, which have kind of clear clinical differentiation from those first generation drugs. And so we've just completed phase 2B. We've just been granted breakthrough designation, and we're moving into phase 3 next year. So there's a class of these medicines that are evolving and being developed and approaching the late stage clinical development and approval. So we expect to see the first psychedelic approved by the FDA in the next few years. And then we'll see a series of drugs following in their footsteps. And we expect to be one of those early movers and the kind of first short duration psychedelics. So the first one with this kind of short time in clinic that really differentiates and makes it more scalable.
You mentioned some drugs that have been around for probably decades now, even longer than that maybe, but how has that evolved? Have they changed at all? Have they been developed from those original drugs?
The kind of context there is that there are naturally occurring psychedelic drugs, and there have been psychedelic drugs in kind of being used in the real world in kind of unregulated settings for a long time in kind of Western culture, certainly quite widely since the 60s. That's very different. So back in the kind of 50s and 60s, there was actually a lot of really promising research into psychedelics and their potential to help with kind of mental health conditions. But then basically drug policy overlapped and the drugs became illegal because they were being used widely for kind of recreational purposes, and the research slowed down very significantly. So what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is a real renaissance in research in these compounds. And actually, so my co-founder was actually my mother, and she was one of the pioneers of this, what's now called the kind of the renaissance of psychedelic research. So she ran a nonprofit called the Beckley Foundation, which did the first ever brain imaging studies on psilocybin and the first ever brain imaging study on LSD, which showed for the first time how these drugs are working in the brain and the kind of mechanisms of action and how they might be used to help mental health conditions. From that, did the first ever psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression study as well, which is now there's a company taking that through phase 3. So it's been a kind of slow snowballing of interest to get the research back to where it kind of had started 50 years ago. And importantly, now from a kind of pharmaceutical perspective, what we're doing, for instance, at Beckley Psytech is working, BPL-003 is a intranasal 5-MeO-DMT benzoate formulation. So 5-MeO-DMT is a naturally occurring psychedelic, and it's known for its very intense and very short duration psychoactive effects. What we've done is develop a salt form of that we have composition of matter patent, and we've formulated it into an intranasal formulation and device and developed it as a proper pharmaceutical drug that can be approved by the FDA. That model is being replicated by other companies as well, with psilocybin, with LSD, with DMT, etc.
Is there still a remnant stigma attached to drugs that were utilized recreationally in the 60s and had a reputation?
I've watched this space. I've grown up in this field, and certainly 20 years ago there was an awful lot of stigma. I would say now that has changed very dramatically. That, of course, there's still some way to go, but in the sense of, for instance, look at our company. We have the former head of global medical affairs for Janssen, the former head of neuroscience for Eli Lilly. Do you see what I mean? We have the very top of the kind of pharmaceutical executives working on psychedelics now. We have the top professors in the top universities in the world in psychiatry and neuroscience working on psychedelics and recognizing that they're important. We have our drug being granted breakthrough designation by the FDA. We have the FDA putting out guidance on psychedelic therapies and recognizing their great potential. We have the administration in the US making public statements about the importance of psychedelics and wanting them to be accelerated in terms of approval. So there is a huge amount of momentum behind this kind of field of medicine now. That doesn't mean that there's no stigma left, but it's a very different picture to what it was 20 years ago.
What kind of conditions specifically is psychedelic medicine applicable to?
I think what we'll see over time, and if you just look at the clinical data so far, where there's the most research so far is in depression. And of course, that's the kind of biggest mental health condition. And there's a lot of really, really compelling data in depression. Our study is one of the examples. Another area that there's a lot of data in is substance use disorder. So I think what we'll see is depression will be the first kind of disease area that actually gets an approval for depression. I think after that, we will see PTSD. There's some very, very compelling data in PTSD. We will see anxiety. There's also very compelling data there already. And we will see substance use disorders. Those, I think, will be the big areas of the first four. But then also we are seeing more and more kind of early stage data in smaller indications like eating disorders and those types of things, end of life anxiety, adjustment disorder, etc. So really, I think the mechanism that psychedelics work on, the kind of serotonergic system and the downregulation of the default mode network, I think that can be applied to a broad range of mental health conditions. And so we will see the range of indications being targeted broadening over time.
Moving on to what you're doing and kind of narrowing the focus to how these things work, could you tell me a bit about BPL-003 and its mode of action?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, so BPL-003 is an intranasal 5-MeO-DMT benzoate. And the treatment model, which is really exciting, and what we've shown in our recent phase 2b trial, is that a single administration of BPL-003, so that's given in a clinic under supervision, and what we showed was a rapid, robust, and durable antidepressant effect. So it was given in a kind of simple single spray in this intranasal device, and the psychoactive effects normally last under an hour, and the patient was deemed dischargeable on average within 2 hours, so dischargeable from the clinic. And then by the day afterwards, we were seeing a robust antidepressant effect. So 1 day afterwards. And then that antidepressant effect was sustained for the full 8 weeks of blinded follow-up in our study. So basically, if you think about how SSRIs work, the kind of standard of care at the moment, you normally have to take a pill every day, and the efficacy is anticipated. You're not really kind of expected to see full efficacy for 6 to 8 weeks. So you'll wait, and there are side effects throughout that period. So you're waiting for a very long time to know whether the treatment's actually working, and you're suffering side effects. Whereas with our treatment, you have the dose on the day, and for those of the people it works for, normally you're seeing within a day, you're seeing the antidepressant effects. And then you are only having that single administration for the whole 2-month period afterward. So it's a very, very different kind of clinical experience for the patient. And I think that's what's really, really exciting. And that's why we've got breakthrough designation. And there's a lot of excitement around BPL-003 as a treatment. I'd like to talk about about Spravato as well, but I'll come on to that because I think that's a very important precedent here as well.
In terms of depression itself, it's very difficult to quantify, and there are very different symptoms in different people. How are you dealing with that in terms of its efficacy and also in dosage and in terms of the clinical trials? Because what is happening in one person isn't the same as another.
I mean, you're totally right about that, and that is one of the major challenges of psychiatry in general. There's no question, and it's a much bigger topic about the kind of limitations of trying to reduce symptoms to single scales of measurement. But of course, for a clinical trial, one has to use something to measure the depression. And obviously, what we actually do is use a whole range of different scales. But the scale that is the kind of primary focus and is the driver of our primary endpoint is the MADRS scale, which is really accepted as the kind of gold standard for measuring depression. And that's really been used across most depression trials, not just with psychedelics, but with all kind of antidepressant clinical trials. So that's what we look at. As you say, depression can manifest in many, many different symptoms. We're looking at treatment-resistant depression, which means it's people who had failed at least 2 other treatments in the same episode, in the current episode of depression, because depression is an episodic chronic disease as well. So we are by definition treating the patients who are hardest to treat, really. And the standard of care is not working for them. But still, that's still a very heterogeneous population. But what we have shown is that the mean reduction in MADRS is significant and clinically meaningful. And what we looked at was the phase 2b had 3 arms. We, instead of a placebo, we actually used a 0.3 milligram active placebo, so a very, very low dose of the drug. So everyone got the drug. Then the medium dose was the 8 milligram dose, and then the 12 milligram was the high dose. And actually, interestingly, what we showed was both the 8 milligram and the 12 milligram showed these rapid and robust antidepressant effects. And in fact, 8 milligrams showed itself to be as effective as 12 milligrams with a slightly better tolerability profile. Of course, it's always better to give less drug if you can. So that was a really, really encouraging finding from the study that we hadn't actually expected. We expected both doses to be effective, but we didn't know if they would separate or not. So the fact that 8 milligrams showed itself to be as effective means that we will most likely be taking that into phase 3, and we think that really gives us confidence from a kind of tolerability profile, etc. as well.
Obviously, the most recent news and very recent news is the breakthrough therapy designation. Could you tell me about that process and, more importantly, what it means for you going forward?
We submitted that after our phase 2b data to the FDA, and it's 4 treatments that the FDA recognize show a really meaningful improvement over what's currently available, the kind of current standard of care, and in an area of really significant unmet need. It means the FDA will prioritize your kind of submissions, your program of development, allow you to have more access to their advice, and ideally accelerate your time to approval as well. So it's a really, really big acknowledgement of how important and exciting they think the data is that we've generated. It's really helpful as we move into phase 3 development that we've got this status within the FDA to really have their help and work with them as partners in moving this forward.
Regarding the delivery, how did you land upon intranasal, and what are the advantages of that?
Yeah, great question. So basically 5-MeO-DMT is not actually orally bioavailable in general. So we had to look at some other route of administration, and there are some options there. The reason we landed on intranasal was from a PK perspective, we thought it offered the most kind of patient-friendly and convenient option. So that's one. There are other routes of administration like IV or inhaled where it is 0 to peak intensity of psychoactive effects within seconds. And we felt like that probably wasn't a kind of patient-friendly option. Whereas with intranasal, it is, 0 to peak intensity in 5 to 10 minutes, which is a much kind of more manageable time frame, we think. And then the overall duration of the psychoactive effects, again, I was saying, generally speaking, is under an hour, which is exactly the kind of sweet spot of what we were looking for. That was one reason. The other really important reason was that there's a well-established regulatory path with intranasal devices and intranasal formulations, and indeed Spravato, which is really the big success story in interventional psychiatry. So that's the esketamine drug that Johnson & Johnson have developed. They're on track for treatment-resistant depression. They are now on track to have $2 billion of revenue this year and exceed that in terms of their peak sales. And again, they are an interventional psychiatric treatment. So you go into the clinic to be administered this drug. And they are also an intranasal delivery. So the current infrastructure that's being created around interventional psychiatry, so all these clinics that have been set up to deliver esketamine, Spravato treatments, they are used to intranasal delivery. And we are actually using a very, very similar device to what Spravato uses. And so we think from a kind of commercial uptake and a kind of the clinician familiarity, patient familiarity, that is also a massive advantage of being intranasal as well.
You were mentioning that kind of 2-month or 8-week efficacy. Is it something that kind of goes down very slowly, or like at what point do you need to re-administer?
That's a really good question again. And so what our trial showed so far is that actually the curves that you see a rapid drop after a day and kind of continue to drop for a week or so. And then it actually just stayed very flat for the full 8 weeks, which was really encouraging. So we made a choice to only do 8 weeks of follow-up. And at that point, we offered patients the opportunity to enter into an open label extension where they could then be given a second dose, or for the people who got the kind of 0.3 active placebo, it would be their first active dose. So at that point, everyone would be given a 12 milligram dose, and then they would be followed for another 8 weeks. So in total, we will have 16 weeks or 4 months of follow-up with up to 2 doses in that period. That data, we completed follow-up. We will be announcing that data soon. So we will be able to show kind of 4-month data with 2 doses soon. Looking at the data we've got, the lines were so flat. Could we have actually pushed out the second dose to 12 weeks? I think certainly it seemed to stay very flat, and actually that corresponds with the open label phase 2A data we've done in the past that has stayed flat for a full 12 weeks as well. So there's the potential that we could actually extend that period. But when we put that again, contextualize that against Spravato, which is, again, the kind of the big success story in interventional psychiatry at the moment. The way that drug works is you have, over the first 4 weeks of induction, you have 8 treatments. So you go to the clinic twice a week for a dose, and you kind of get to full efficacy by week 4. After that, you, generally speaking, are still going to the clinic once a week for another dose to maintain effect. So in that 8-week period, you probably had 12 clinic visits and 12 doses. So that's, if you think about the time for a patient to go drive or be driven to the clinic, because you can't drive, be driven back from the clinic, and then spend 2 hours under supervision in the clinic, that is a lot of time out of someone's life to get that treatment. What we showed with BPL-003 was, in the same period, we had 1 clinic visit. The antidepressant effect was seen within a day afterwards, as I said, and we showed comparable levels of antidepressant effects at week 4 with our single dose, as was shown with their 8 doses. So basically, in this period, this 4 to 8 week period, we are showing comparable levels of efficacy, but with only 1 clinic administration rather than 8 to 12. So that's a huge advantage for the patients and the clinicians and the payers and everyone. So that's a really important point as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to the patient themselves, which is obviously the most important thing in the whole pathway, what is the effect for patients, and what are they saying in terms of what it's doing for them?
With the phase 2B, of course, that was kind of handled. There was a multi-center site. It was across 6 countries in the US and Europe and Australia, and 35 sites. So there were a lot of different patients in a lot of different settings, which is really important. And important to highlight, over 95% of them had never taken a psychedelic before. What we kind of have follow-up, but that's obviously kind of, it's a anonymized, etc. I think what we have done is open label studies where we've been able to do more direct interviews with the patients. We've done microphenomenology interviews, which is really talking about the characterizing the subjective effects of the experience. We're about to publish a paper on that as well. So it depends what you're asking. In terms of the kind of peak psychoactive effects, it's normally a very intense experience and can be a challenging experience, can be a kind of euphoric experience. And anyway, there's a range of different experiences that people go through. But importantly, the side effects of the vast majority of side effects are on the day of dosing and are transient. And generally, from an AE profile, we've shown a very good AE profile. And then certainly there is a decent category of people who fall into remission. So after that single dose of the drug, they go into remission where, they are no longer depressed. So there's a category of really strong responders, and then there are moderate responders, and then there are non-responders, like all drugs.
Because sometimes when people take medication for depression, all that it's really doing is dulling their senses, and it's not really addressing much. I was wondering if people are just transformed by this, where they're feeling like, wow, I feel really good.
Absolutely. And I think that's, if we generalize more broadly across psychedelic therapies, that's one of the kind of crucial differences compared to the more traditional SSRIs, which is very much a kind of dampening of your depressive symptoms. Whereas what happens with psychedelics often is the actual kind of experience itself is often reported back as one of the most meaningful experiences of the patient's lives. And that's literally kind of categorized. In early academic research, they were looking at that, and often a high proportion of people would characterize it as one of the 5 most meaningful experiences in their lives. And so that's a very different type of treatment. And often it also, measures that we've looked at is kind of emotional insight and those types of things. So there are a lot of kind of different ways of characterizing this experience. Obviously, trying to characterize the subjective is naturally quite difficult, but there is this common theme of kind of emotional insight, emotional breakthrough, sometimes a kind of inverted commas mystical experience, change of sense of time and space, and it's kind of psychodynamic experiences where they have insights into their childhood or their current existing relationships, etc. So it's and that's why there is psychological support that goes along with it. So, you know, beforehand you are given some preparation about the experience, and afterwards there is follow-up where people kind of are allowed to kind of talk about their experience to some extent as well. So in a way, the actual dosing is this kind of time point where there's this kind of massive shake up in the brain. There's this down regulation of the default mode network, increased connectivity in other parts of the brain, and it opens up these kind of neural pathways and this term neuroplasticity, so where you can form new patterns of thinking and behavior, basically. So it's a very, very different way of treating mental health conditions compared to what's gone before.
Do you have any other assets in the pipeline currently?
That's something worth highlighting that I haven't mentioned yet. So we actually also have agreed to a strategic merger with a publicly listed company called Life Sciences. So we're in the process of doing a strategic combination where we will join forces and become Beckley as a publicly listed entity. They are also a psychedelic focused mental health drug development company. And so together we're aiming to be the leading developer of psychedelic therapies for mental health. And they have a pipeline, and then we're bringing BPL-003. So BPL-003 will be the lead asset. It will be going into phase 3, and we think Beckley really gives us the best possible platform to accelerate that program, and then the scale of the company to bring together our learnings, because they have a couple of phase 2 clinical assets that are really exciting as well. So they have a drug called VLS-01, which is an oral film of DMT, which is a different drug to 5-MeO-DMT, which is BPL-003. DMT is the kind of active ingredient of ayahuasca, and it's, again, really compelling data so far that it's a very effective antidepressant. And so that's going through a phase 2b at the moment for treatment-resistant depression. And then there's EMP-01, which is an R-MDMA. So that's a kind of analog of MDMA, looking at social anxiety disorder. So we're actually going to have this kind of really exciting and quite differentiated pipeline of these types of treatment. And we think there's so much learning that we can take from each of those programs together and a certain scale. So it's a really exciting moment for the whole space, and for us as a company joining forces. It's all quite exciting at the moment.
Do you think that this is the future of interventional psychiatry?
Yeah, I really do, actually. I think Spravato and the kind of ketamine drugs have a lot of potential as well, and are showing great potential, and their increased uptake over the last few years is really, really promising. So I think they are paving the way for interventional psychiatry. I think that is one thing that was really important. Then AbbVie, another very established company, they've recently acquired a psychedelic company called Gilgamesh, who are doing a kind of short duration psychedelic drug, a DMT analog as well, which has only done a relatively small trial, but they bought that was a deal worth over $1 billion. And again, it's another big pharma company entering this kind of interventional psychiatry with psychoactive drugs. So they're entering it as well. And I think there's really a lot more interest across the kind of pharmaceutical industry at the moment for these types of things. So I do think they are going to become more and more established as the treatment of choice. Now, just to be clear, I still anticipate, at least for the kind of relatively foreseeable future, that they're not going to replace SSRIs. SSRIs are very cheap and very easy to prescribe and have a lot of data behind them. So I think what we're talking about with interventional psychiatry is more kind of second, third line treatments rather than first line treatments for most people, to start with at least.
Given the number of different conditions and problems that there are to be solved, how do you see psychedelic medicine evolving?
I think there's an enormous amount of potential to help a really broad range of treatments. I think as well, at the moment we're still at this phase, mostly we've been getting kind of phase 2 data. I think as the data sets get bigger, you're going to see different compounds differentiate in terms of side effect profile, in terms of secondary endpoints, in terms of those types of things. So some treatments will be better at anxiety, some treatments will be better for substance use disorder, some treatments will be better for depression. The comorbidities of substance use disorder and depression, for instance, or PTSD. And so there's going to be a lot of that kind of market positioning and differentiation as the data sets grow. And I think what you're going to see is interventional psychiatric clinics becoming specialists in identifying which patients would benefit from which treatment option. But we're in the exciting bit where kind of proof of concept has happened, but I think there's still a long way to go in terms of how much we can learn to optimize for the right patients getting the right treatments and kind of optimizing for efficacy and access for people.
I assume then that something like AI's ability to examine lots of data would be useful in that respect too?
Totally. Look, that holy grail, and there's a lot of data being generated and a lot of data analysis is going to be happening across this space over the next few years. But the more we can identify who's going to be the super responder ahead of time, who should be given these treatments and who shouldn't be given these treatments, the better. Now that, again, individualized medicine, really that's the case for all medicines. But I do think there's some, I think there's some really interesting research that's going to go on within this particular field around that. And I also think there's some really interesting potential for other modalities like digital therapeutics to come in as well here. So to kind of be modules to come in together. So I think if you think of psychedelics as creating this window of neuroplasticity, so that it suddenly opens this opportunity for people to make behavioral change more so than they otherwise would have been. And I think if you can layer on top digital therapeutics or psychotherapy or some other psychosociological behavioral intervention, I think you can see increased efficacy for patients and also efficiencies and all of those types of things. So I think that's the next step, but we've got a while before we get there.
Psychedelics clearly can help with depression, PTSD and many other conditions, so let's hope Beckley Psytech and others can provide more help for more people. And there are far more people with depression than we could ever imagine. Anyway, that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities or if you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. I'm sure it won't be long today before children in costumes are knocking on the door for free sugar masquerading as candy. I'd give them healthy snacks, but I'm sure I'd find them all in the garden in the morning. Another wet weekend forecast here, but on the bright side, the clocks go back in North America this weekend, so I don't have to miscalculate all my interview times for next week. So until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.